Good evening, everyone, and welcome to How to Deliver Effective Persuasive Testimony, an educational webinar that is being presented by the Ward 6 Democrats and by our representatives to the DC Democrats. And you'll hear a little bit more about them in just a second. My name is Elizabeth Engel. I'm the president of the Ward 6 Democrats. I'm very happy to see all of you here. This event, as I mentioned, is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel later this week. The Ward 6 Dems host events like this as part of fulfilling our mission to build community across the diverse neighborhoods of Ward 6, to elect Democratic Party candidates, to educate voters. That's what this evening is about, to support the Democratic Party ideals and principles, and to work towards DC statehood. You can learn more about us at ward6dems.org, which you can see in my fantastic virtual background here, but go check out our website and see what we're up to. And I did want to recognize a couple of folks this evening. One is our Ward 6 committee men and women who are one of our presenters for this evening. And Frank will talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And I also wanted to recognize Erin Sheehan. Erin, wave to everyone. Erin is our events chair, and she is the one who did all the hard work of putting this event together. And we are very grateful for her. And with that, I will turn it over to Frank Avery, who is one of our Ward 6 committeemen.
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. I really appreciate it. And thanks, Councilmember Allen, for joining. Thanks, Aaron, for your help in organizing this. And thanks to all of you so much for joining tonight. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm Frank Avery, and I'm one of your elected Ward 6 committeemen serving the DC State Democratic Committee. And while some of them couldn't be here tonight, I'm also joined in effectively co-sponsoring events tonight by Melissa Leitner, our committee woman, Dorinda White, our other committee woman, and Dawn Dinnan, who is our other committee man. I can talk about the structure in just a second. But we're really pleased to be able to have this opportunity, and thank you again, Councilmember Allen, for accepting the invite to join us tonight, and Elizabeth and Aaron for working with us to get all the logistics set up and invite the Democrats across Ward 6. So as you kind of heard a second ago, each year in the primary election, Democrats have an opportunity to vote for elected committeemen and committeewomen, who then become the elected representatives, either for the ward or as at-large members to the Democratic State Party. For gender equity, there's some committee man seats and committee woman seats. There's debates if you'd like to have those in the party around, maybe if that needs to be amended moving forward to be a little bit more inclusive, but it's done with benevolent intentions back in the day to help increase and make sure that there's appropriate representation in the party. And then in addition to the ward level seats, we have at-large seats, and I don't think Matt LaFortune was here tonight, but Matt LaFortune he's a Ward 6 resident, but serves as one of our at-large seats. And the purpose of the role that we really serve is to be your eyes and ears into the ward for the state party, and to help advocate for Ward 6 perspectives when the state party needs input from Democrats across the district. It works great sometimes. We like to host workshops, and there's other really good processes that you can engage in to help steer the direction of the Democratic State Party and making sure that they're representing your needs, what you think the party should be advocating for. A great example is, and I think a few days on Saturday, they'll be hosting a retreat that I believe Democrats across the district are welcome to attend, and I'll put my email in later if you're interested in that. And then there's committee structures, caucuses, and all sorts of different groups to help make sure that the appropriate affinity group that you want to represent in the party has a chance to be represented. Other times, of course, it is a state party. You're always negotiating different perspectives. And so you might see things pop up where you're like, hey, I don't know if that's really the way I felt about something. Reach out to us. That's what we're here for as your Ward 6 representatives to the party. Sometimes things have to move fast, and so things get stamped as the party line. But if it's not something that you felt was appropriate, be sure to let us know, because we're there to make sure that the entire committee is aware of how you feel about the positions that we're taking and how the party's operating. So I'd encourage you to do that. And in the spirit of today's events, the committee men and committee women are an excellent resource when you need to advocate for something. So we, as I mentioned, advise the party on issues, and we can help leverage the party a bit on your behalf. And then we work collaboratively with groups and in many cases overlap with officers of our ward level Democrats like the Ward 6 Dems tonight. So it's why you hear a lot of gratitude to me from me for Elizabeth and Aaron for setting things up tonight. The reason why our committee men and committee women wanted to partner with the Ward 6 Dems tonight is in that spirit of advocacy of what we hope folks will come to us with to help advise the party. But more importantly, we want to make sure folks, as good Democrats in the ward, understand some of the best practices to advocate for the things that they think are important to their council, to their mayor, and to other folks. And we thought, who better to do it than our council member who's served for, is now on his third term on the council. So lots of experience, lots of advice, and then a great Democrat for the party. And so I'm really grateful, Charles, for you joining tonight. And I'll turn it over to Aaron so you can set up kind of the logistics rules on the road, and then we can all be quiet so folks can talk with your council member, which I think was what most folks, I imagine, are here for. But like I said, I'll put my stuff in the chat if anybody wants to follow up. And thanks so much, Aaron.
Perfect. Thank you, Frank. Again, my name is Erin Sheehan. I am the events chair for Ward 6 STEMs. I also apologize. There's some loud cooking happening in my background. So if you all can hear that, just know I'm going to have a great dinner soon. Anyways, I just wanted to set up a reminder that this is an educational event. We're not looking to debate specific policies or discuss those here, but really to learn about what effective testimony is. And then hopefully you all can use that later on to testify about the specific policies that you're passionate about. So Councilmember Allen is going to start with a short presentation, just going over how do you actually sign up to testify, and then some of the things that he finds very effective in testimony that he hears. And then we'll open it up to some Q&A. So during that Q&A, of course, you can use the raise hand function in the toolbar, type your question in the chat, and then we'll go ahead and call on you and ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question. I think the final note I'll say is just to please be respectful of our council member and to each other. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Councilmember Allen.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Elizabeth, Aaron, Frank, everybody, thanks so much for having me tonight. It's good to see everyone. And Aaron, you may have loud cooking sounds in the background. I'm going to have loud children sounds in the background at some point. So I know we're all going to figure it out. But I'm excited to be here with you. What I was going to do, kind of just how Aaron outlined, maybe talk a little bit about kind of the logistics of hearing effective testimony, maybe give some tips that I've kind of seen over the years, like what kind of breaks through sometimes and how that really can be most impactful. But really, I want to help answer your questions and kind of talk to you about this. I know a lot of folks are going to know me as your council member. Before I went to the council, I was an advocate. So I sat in the seat testifying in front of council. So it was I spent a couple of years sitting, at the table, speaking up to the council members, trying to advocate for an issue or advocate for budget. And so that helped me have a lens when I sat on the other side to really understand what it takes to prepare, to wait, frankly. Oftentimes it's a lot of waiting until you get your chance to testify. And so I think it's really important for the council to be really respectful of the fact that somebody probably took a lot of time to prepare for their testimony. They took a lot of time off maybe. And there's a lot of other elements that went into that. So when I'm sharing a hearing and when I'm there, I try really hard to make sure that we're listening and staying attention. Sometimes those hearings go 8, 10, 12 hours. And so you got to stay focused the whole time, but it's something that I think is really important to respect the time you took to be there. So let me start by just kind of outlining a little bit about our hearing process and just kind of what that looks like at the council. So we don't work like Congress, where Republicans get to invite 2 people, Democrats get to invite 2 people, and it's very orchestrated, and that's it. Most hearings that we hold at the council are open to the public. And what I mean by that is everybody can testify. They're all open meetings, but literally anybody who wants to put their 2 cents in has an opportunity to come do that. That can sometimes mean very long hearings, but I think it also just ensures that we give as much space as possible for voices. Now, for those of you that have been around and done this before, there's the ways we held hearings pre-pandemic, and then there's ways we held hearings after the pandemic. Like a lot of us, the pandemic forced the council to change the way in which we operate a significant amount. So we now have, in many cases, virtual testimony. Now, over the last year, what you've seen the council do is probably move more, you may see it more to a hybrid setting where some people testify in person, some people still do online. I will say I like having people in the room. I think that's something that's important, and I do enjoy and value that. I will say, though, that what we have experienced is that by opening it up to where people can join virtually, we have many more people that are able to get their voice heard and be able to testify. And in particular, many more voices that otherwise would not be able to take the time off in the middle of the day to come share their voice. I think that's been really beneficial. I can tell you, I remember we had a hearing where there was a young man had been killed, and his father wanted to testify. His father hung sheetrock for a contractor. There was no scenario where he probably could have taken time off to be able to, take that shift off of work, come it down to the Wilson building. But because we had a virtual option, his coworkers actually just kind of covered for him for 3 or 4 minutes while he was able to talk about this loss that he experienced, what he wanted to see his city do. And he had, his vest and helmet on, and then he went right back to work. That wouldn't happen. That type of making sure his voice, honoring his son and being able to testify, wouldn't happen without a virtual setting. So I think it's been really valuable and important that we are more accessible by having that option. So the hearings themselves, oftentimes, if you think about, for example, an oversight hearing or a budget hearing, and I'll talk more about what those things are, or a legislative hearing, you have public testimony first. So that's when it's basically an all call. Everybody can sign up and testify for that. And then we move to government witnesses usually after that. I think that's helpful because we want to hear what the public has to say, and that often informs the type of questions we're then going to ask the agency director or the representative from the mayor's office who's going to be there. Some logistics. We've moved to a new online system for registering for a hearing. And I think for anybody who's used to the way we used to do it, which was you had to email, you had to call, you had to track somebody down, sign up for a hearing, then we'd probably have to email you and then track you down to get more information. We now have a system that allows you to sign up online. And I'll give you an example of how this all works. So on the DC Council website, our hearing management system is at a website, lims.dccouncil.gov/hearings. And that's where you'll find a calendar that lists all the upcoming hearings that are happening. I'll use one of my hearings as an example to be able to help show you how that works. So if you go and you look down through the calendar and you look to February 9th, you'll see that the Transportation and Environment Committee, the committee I chair, is holding an oversight hearing. And it gives you a little link and you can click on that page. What you'll see there are what are the topics of the hearing. So in this example, it's an oversight hearing for 4 different agencies. It then has a hearing notice. That's what we have to write to tell the public, we're holding a hearing on this date, on this time, on this subject. So you have that document right there in front of you. And then you can even see, so for example, I can see right here, I have 31 people that have already registered to testify at the Department of Transportation oversight hearing. And there's a link at the top that says register to testify, and then another link that says submit testimony. I'll come back to that in a second about why that's important. But this online system just makes it a lot easier to be able to register yourself, sign up. Now, oftentimes people want to be able to testify as a group. And when we come back to what's effective, I recommend if you're testifying with 2 or 3 or 4 people, cluster yourselves together. So that way people can be there. I think it's thematically very helpful when you're hearing somebody or a group of people testify on the same topic. So you can really kind of dig into that issue. Let's say you didn't all testify, you didn't sign up at the same time. This is where you want to contact staff. Let's say Frank, Elizabeth, and Aaron all wanted to sign up and testify, but of course they signed up, maybe a couple of hours apart. What you would do is you just email the committee director or the council member who's the chair of that committee, and you say, hey, the 3 of us would really like to testify as a group. More often than not, we'll certainly exercise that discretion. We'll go through the witness list. We'll push everybody together so that you can testify together. The other question you want to look at in a hearing, again, this is on the kind of the process side, is are you testifying in person or are you testifying virtually? So if you're testifying in person, you're going to be coming down to the Wilson building. We have 4 different hearing rooms where you would go. And that allows you to be able to be in person. Some hearings, again, are going to be held virtually. And so that's, again, where you can, you could be at work, you could be at home, kind of provide you maximum flexibility to be able to do that. But you're going to be looking for when and where you're able to testify. The next thing you want to think about is, how much time do I have to testify? In most cases, you're going to have 3 minutes to testify if you're testifying as an individual. If you're testifying as part of an organization, so let's say Elizabeth is testifying as the president of the Ward 6 Democrats, she would then get 5 minutes. So typically the council will give an organization 5 minutes, an individual 3 minutes. Now you might say, well, I know how I'm going to figure this out. Elizabeth, Aaron, and Frank are all going to come testify from the Ward 6 Democrats, so we have 15 minutes total. We're not on to you. The first person gets 5 minutes, and then each person from the same organization typically gets 3 minutes. Now, the chair of the committee can have a little bit of discretion about what that looks like, but that's roughly what your time frame is. We are not as strict as some other places. So let's say your testimony is at 3 minutes, but actually you need about 3.5 minutes. Very rarely are you going to get like cut off right at 3 minutes. You usually can kind of wrap up your thoughts or your statement or the point you were trying to make. I've seen sometimes when there's like 120 witnesses on a hearing, when that 3 minutes goes off, that's it, because I want to be respectful of the next person, because it's very easy in a hearing to start getting hours and hours behind schedule, because once you start giving one person a few minutes, then the next person a few extra minutes, it starts to add up, and that person who's number 80 on the witness list gets pushed back really, really late, and that's not fair to them, so we try to keep that on schedule and on track. When you are in person, the tables have 4 seats. So typically people want to come in groups of 4 if you're a group, for example, and you can organize it so that you come as 4, which means you get the whole table, you get the whole round, and every question that council members are going to be asking is on your topic, right? When it's virtual, we tend to have larger panels, maybe 8 or 10 people at a time. So just kind of keep that in your mind of like, if you're going to be in person, it's going to be probably you and 3 other people. If you're online, you might be in a panel of 8 people. So that could be 8 different topics. It could be, one topic. I think it's more impactful when a panel is focused on one topic, because what it does is after your panel goes and you've had your 3 minutes, it then goes to the council members to ask questions. So as the person who has to ask the questions, if I have 8 different topics and I'm only given a certain amount of time as well, usually I'm given maybe 5 minutes to ask questions, maybe 8 minutes to ask questions. I've got to figure out how would I cover 8 topics in 5 minutes. I'm not going to be able to do that. So if you have a panel that all talks about the same issue, that actually forces me to come to your issue. So that's one of my tips I give to a lot of folks is sign up as a group and try to testify as a group, because it helps the council member have to come to your issue rather than say, there's 8 different topics here, I'll cherry pick 1 or 2, and I'm not going to be able to engage as much. So I really am a big believer of you're going to be more effective when you testify as a group. Sometimes people ask me, is it okay if we say the same thing? It's okay if you're all touching on the same theme. After 10 people tell me the exact same thing over and over again, I may not have any more questions. Like from a questioning perspective, it becomes less effective if they're saying the same thing. But if you have the same theme and you're telling different stories or you're telling different perspectives of the same theme, I think that's very powerful. It's also really effective to be able to share your own personal experience. So let's say you're testifying about something, an agency isn't working the right way. You try to get a permit with DCRA or now Department of Buildings, and you're testifying about a frustration of the way government works. Share your personal story, because that allows me and my staff to then figure out, how do I follow up with you on that issue? How do I help understand what it was that didn't work the way it should have to follow that? If you're talking about a piece of legislation or an issue, the more that you can make it personal, the more you can share your own story and your own relationship with that, I think is very powerful, because we have folks that will come testify and it's unclear like what their motivation is sometimes, right? They're testifying about a topic. Are they employed by a certain organization? Are they an advocate within an organization? From a residential perspective, if you come in and you help tell the personal story of why this matters to you, why did you take off time to be here? That really matters, and it helps us understand a bit more of what your motivation is, and you'll more likely get questions from the council members because they want to understand what brought you here today. Why did you want to share that story with me? What's the change that we're thinking about making, and how that'll change the outcome of what it was you experienced? So I know that it's oftentimes hard to share your own personal stories, especially when there are harder stories to share. But I think it's an important part of us hearing your truth. And I think most members of the council, most members of the staff will definitely respect and give you that space to share the story that you want. It's your words and it's powerful. And so we want to make sure you have that chance to do that. Another thing, just kind of a process and logistics piece, is sometimes you'll get questions around, do you need to write your testimony out? Do you have to submit it in advance? Do you submit it afterwards? I find, council members everybody's a little bit different. Chairman Mendelson, for example, he really likes to have written testimony in advance. So he would want you, preferably, to have written your testimony, have submitted it on the website, and he has it printed off in front of him as you're talking. And you may at first think he's not looking at you while you're talking. That's disrespectful. Actually, most likely he's reading your testimony in front of him as you're talking. And so that's one of the ways to work. Some of us, it's helpful if I have written testimony, but I'm probably trying to key in and listen to you. So I don't necessarily need to have it in front of me. The written testimony, though, is very important for the committee's work, for the legislative work that comes after. So what happens, let's use a piece of legislation as an example. Let's say you come in and you say, hey, listen, you guys, you're halfway there, but you really need to make these changes. Here's the 3 changes I recommend you make to this legislation that'll make it better. We want that in writing because your written testimony will now get incorporated as part of the written legislative record. And it gives us something to go back to when we say, well, what was it Elizabeth was talking about? I remember she had 3 issues she really wanted us to follow up on. Let me make sure I go back to my written testimony. I can read it and say, oh, that's right. Okay, I agree with that one. I don't know if I agree with this. Okay, and it helps us be able to create a written record of your testimony. And that written testimony will also become a part of the official record. So it will live on in perpetuity as part of your testimony and kind of the legislative record of how we ended up passing a law. So I think that's a helpful tool to make sure you get that written testimony. Now, occasionally you might actually have prepared testimony. Something's happening during the hearing, you're learning new information, and you say, oh man, I would have added an extra page of information or recommendations on this. Whenever we hold a hearing on legislation, we keep what we call the record open for a number of time, for usually about 2 weeks, so that you have a chance to come back and add more testimony to it. And that can be a really helpful way. Let's say just during the conversation and discussion on the piece of legislation or whatever the issue is, you have new ideas or new information. We want to make sure that gets included, and so you're able to add that in. And I think those are really helpful. The other part I would say is sometimes it can be very frustrating to testify, especially in a very long hearing. Let's take the example of when maybe there's 100 witnesses that are coming. That's going to be a hearing that lasts all day. Oftentimes, council members, when there's a very long day, there's 100, 150 witnesses coming through, they may not spend as much time asking you questions. And that can be very frustrating, I think, from a resident's perspective, because I know as an advocate, when I would spend all this time preparing testimony, I'd come down to the Wilson building, I'd wait for 2 hours, get my chance to testify, and then nobody asked me a question. That can be very frustrating. So I think being able to have more effective testimony, being able to make a personal story or a personal connection to it is one of the ways that you try to get those council members to ask you a question. Because that's part of what you're trying to accomplish. You're not just trying to give us 3 minutes of testimony or 5 minutes of testimony. You're trying to get into a conversation. And I think that's one of the ways to do it again, is making it personal, making me understand why'd you show up today? You know, why did you take time off work? Why'd you spend that time preparing? But I do respect and know it can be frustrating if there's, 100 witnesses that are signed up. We're trying to make sure we can hear from everybody. There may be some situations when we don't have questions on that. I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. I can answer that. So I'll just mention a couple other quick items. There's different types of hearings that we hold at the council. And I think the way you kind of strategize for each one's a little bit different. So we're about to begin, for example, our oversight hearings. So oversight hearings take place usually in late January and February and early March. And those are oversight hearings of your DC agencies. So that's you coming in to tell us, listen, I think the agency's got it wrong, or I think the agency's got it right, or they need to be doing it differently, or they're sitting on this project and we really need to push them forward. That's when you're going to be coming to tell us, this is what I think is working right, and this is what I think is working wrong in my city. And I think that's a helpful way to kind of think about those hearings. After that, typically late March and early April through the month of April and May, we then move into budget hearings. So that time frame is when the mayor has proposed her annual budget. The council is now reviewing those budget recommendations. And invariably, there's going to probably be things that you like in that budget and things you don't like in that budget. And so you're coming to tell the council, I like this, I don't like that. So in that, you're trying to convey to us your support for certain initiatives or your opposition to certain decisions. I think it's always helpful if you offer an alternative, right? Don't just come tell me what you don't like. Tell me what the alternative should be. I think that's a really powerful way. It also helps me want to ask you a question. If you say we shouldn't go left, you just think we should go right, well, then why should we go right? Help me understand that motivation, right? So I think that's one of the ways to look at that. Then there's legislative hearings. So that's going to be something where you've got a copy of a piece of legislation in front of you. You're able to look at it. You're going to probably tell us, this is what I like, this is what I don't like, this is what you should do different. Just like with budget, if you think we shouldn't do something, tell me why, and tell me maybe what's a better way that you think we should get at it. That's one of the ways, again, to be effective with that. And then the last kind of type of hearing is more of a topical hearing. So let's say with transportation and the environment, I want to hold a hearing on the status of the health of the Anacostia River. That's going to be a topical hearing. And so you've got the space to come in and talk about a number of different issues that you think are important. And so those are structured a little bit differently, sometimes a bit more open-ended, but that way it's not something that's, hard and fast. You've got to only come in with certain things. So those are 4 main types of hearings that we typically have, and I think it's helpful. The last thing, sometimes I get people to ask me, as the council, we hold hearings, we have committee markups, and then we have legislative sessions. And sometimes people will say, well, I want to come testify at your legislative session. We don't do public testimony when we're voting. So think about that as like when the House or Senate are voting on the floor. There's not public testimony happening during that point. That's when actually the debate happens among the legislators and then casting a vote. So that's not a space where you'd see a hearing. But all of your work and your testimony leading up to that, hopefully, makes for a better product. And I can guarantee you, I do it all the time. I cite, when I'm in that debate with my colleagues, I'm citing things that people brought to me in the hearings, and I'm referencing things that you said and brought that forward. So that's how you make the impact to be able to help shape and form that debate. So I hope that's a helpful piece. I know we want to leave plenty of time for kind of discussion and helping answer questions. And I think we have a few questions that were already kind of teed up. And so how about Elizabeth and Aaron, unless I missed something really big, we'll just kind of transition to some of the Q&A. Does that work for you?
That sounds great. Thank you, Councilmember Allen.
Great.
So as the council member mentioned, we're going to be starting with some questions now, and we'll start with the questions that were submitted in advance. Assuming that we get through those, which we probably will, we'll go to live questions. So remember, you can either use the raise hand function in the toolbar if you want to speak, or you can type your question into the chat, and Aaron and I will queue it up. If you do decide that you want to speak, please wait to be recognized. And then when your turn comes up, we'll ask you to unmute yourself so you can go ahead and ask your question. So I guess one of the questions that had come in advance that wasn't the sort of answer, but not exactly, but is testifying only for experts? And I think that means not just experts in the sense of like officials, but also like people who are super expert about whatever the topic is.
Oh, your experience is your expertise. So I think a lot of people feel intimidated, frankly, by coming down into in a big setting, in a big formal setting. There's cameras. I mean, just think about any legislature, right? The legislatures always sit a couple of feet higher up than the main floor. Like everything about it is set up to be intimidating. And so I don't want you to ever feel like you can't come into that space, own it, and be able to share your story. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be a policy expert on something. Your lived experience, the reason why you mattered about this issue, that is your expertise. And so I want you to know that you are the expert already. Let's say you had an experience in an agency and you're coming to say, this agency's broken. It's not working what I need. You're the expert on that. You lived it. You went through it. And so sharing that and making sure you feel ownership of that, you are the expert already. And I want you to feel like you are bringing your expertise.
Another question that you had addressed sort of, but somebody had specifically asked about this is, what's the role of council staff? What role do they play in this whole process?
Council staff are the workhorses, right? So nothing happens without really great staff. And I know that on this call, we've got some folks who either are or were, legislative staff in different spaces. So the staff are the folks that actually get a lot of the work done. Oftentimes what happens with my staff, for example, they're going to be emailing and having conversations with witnesses that come in who have questions, or they want to submit that testimony, or they ask like, hey, I'm looking for this information. Can you help point me in the right direction? And my staff will try to help assist to make sure they know where to go for that type of information to draw from. Also, though, if you have questions, I'm not quite sure how long my testimony should be, or when am I supposed to sign up and testify? The staff will try to answer all of those. And when I'm holding a hearing, my staff is also, for example, monitoring the chat. So in a virtual hearing, people might type in a question, be like, I'm not quite sure what's happening here, or what's the lineup or my order, and the staff are trying to respond there. They can do everything from the logistics to the nuanced policy and legislative issues. So make friends with the staff. They're amazing. And they're the reason that a lot of things actually get done. And so I really would strongly recommend, if you have any hesitancy or any questions, reach out to the staff, because they're going to help get that answered for you.
James Bullock had submitted a question in advance, and he is on the call this evening. So James, this has kind of been discussed already, but I wanted to make sure that you felt your question had been answered. He had said, that isolated testimony is just one voice, and he wanted to know how he can effectively coordinate with others making similar points to increase impact. And Charles, you had talked a little bit about this, but since that was a key question, I wanted to make sure that got raised.
Yeah, and it's a great question, James. And if you don't feel like I've answered it, please let me know. But one voice can be very powerful, right? So I don't want you to feel that, like, well, why should I show up to the hearing? I'm just one voice. One voice can be very powerful, and especially the way you tell the story, the way you tell your advocacy, I think matters a lot. The reason why in a hearing setting, I think being able to try to find like-minded people, or folks that want to be able to kind of help share a similar story or a theme. I mentioned earlier, when we have a hearing that's in the building, for example, the table only has 4 chairs. So if you and 3 other people all come in and say, you know what, we are going to talk about how the sky is going to be blue. You get to control, by effectively getting 4 people, you've taken every seat, you get to control the next 30 minutes of the conversation. That's the way I would think about it. You're being able to help tell your story the way you want to, and nobody else is talking about anything else other than the skies being blue. And then from a council perspective, once you finish your testimony, all the council members then have what we call a round of questions. So we're able to ask you questions. Well, I'm probably not going to ask about something that's not about the sky being blue. And so you've now been able to corner the council by having all those seats filled with your message, that my questions now are all going to be related about the things you want to talk about. And so I think that's why that's an effective way to do it. In a virtual setting, again, when you have kind of 4, or if the panels are larger, kind of 8, you don't need to find 8 people necessarily, but having, 3 or 4, I think it really shows the council, I got a big group of people here, let me focus on that. And so I hope that's helpful. James can help answer that, but I think that's why I think having a group, and it doesn't have to be huge, right? I've had hearings where, people organized 40 people to come deliver the same message. Well, by the time I'm at the 28th person telling me the exact same thing, I'm not hearing anything new. So you don't have to get 30, 40, 50 people. I do think, getting 4 or 5 people really is impactful, though.
We also have a question from submitted by Christine Healy, who I don't think is actually on right now.
I see her.
Is she here?
She's here. Yep.
Okay. Good. So Christine, I'm asking your question, and again, feel free if there's follow-up or anything like that, to unmute yourself. But Charles, you had talked a little bit about the role of written testimony versus verbal testimony. If somebody's submitting their written testimony, but they're also going to appear, whether in person or virtually. Christine was curious about, whether council members review written testimony submitted for the record by people who are unable to attend a hearing, and what impact that written testimony may have on the debates around policies.
That's a great question. And that's one where I think a lot of people say, what's the best use of my time, right? Of preparing testimony like that. I think the reality is, if you don't come to a hearing, but you submit written testimony, it is not going to be read by all 13 members of the council. It will, however, be read by the chair of that committee and by the staff of that committee. So I'll use let's use a piece of legislation as an example. So Transportation and the Environment Committee, we're working on legislation, and someone can't come to the hearing, but they send written testimony. It's going to count just the same as someone who's in person from the standpoint of getting entered into the record. That testimony will get added to the legislative record and the committee report as part of testimony. And the staff will actually read it. There's actually a part of our committee reports where we have to summarize testimony. So literally someone will have to read your testimony and then maybe reduce it down to kind of 2 or 3 sentences. And then as the committee chair, as I'm getting ready to advance that bill, my staff and I are working through the committee report. I'm reading all the testimony that came in. So it will be read by at least one council member, and it definitely read by the staff. But I also will be upfront with you. When I move legislation through my committee, there's 5 members of a committee. I cannot guarantee you that the other 4 have probably read every page and every testimony. But I do, so I want to be realistic with that, but I do think that it matters, and it also will become a part of the official legislative record.
And then we also had a question by Audrey Miller-Hallett, who I see is also on the call tonight. So Audrey, again, as I had mentioned for Mr. Bullock, if you have a follow-up or anything, feel free to hop in here. But she had asked, a lot of legislation amends existing law, and it can be difficult to track the wording of prior legislation to appreciate the full scope of what's being proposed in the new law. Are there resources to turn to for a holistic understanding of what's being proposed that includes a comparison of the current law insertion of new language?
That is a great question, and it is one that actually your council members and your council staff also have to struggle with. So when a piece of legislation is coming in, and let's say it's amending, to your point, Audrey, it's amending underlying statute. So we oftentimes will use it as, we use the phrase, like either a red line version or a comparative print. And what we mean by that is you want to be able to see what is it actually amending, because when I am drafting a bill to introduce, I don't have to actually show necessarily what it is I'm amending. I'm just making the amendments. So it does require a little bit of digging to be able to read through and say, okay, well, you're actually changing an and to an or you're changing a whole section, or you're deleting something. I didn't realize you were deleting something. So it does take a little bit of extra effort, but that's one of the things that we have to do as well. And so I think that's where you want to use staff, right? If you reach out to that committee staff and you say, is there a comparative version of this legislation? Is there a red line version that I can review? That would be one of the ways, because I guarantee you they're preparing that for their council member. That could be one way to kind of get that, to help make that process a little bit easier, especially for someone who maybe isn't an attorney or hasn't worked in the legislative space a lot. And I hope that helps answer that, Audrey. I got a thumbs up. All right.
Cool. Okay. So Scott Price had asked a question in the chat. Scott, you're welcome to unmute yourself if you'd like to. Or if not, I can go ahead and read your question out to Councilmember Allen. I'll give that a second.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So Scott had asked, how do I learn how the committee perceives the testimony? In many hearings, there isn't really a lot of feedback. And so it's kind of hard to tell, was the information received? How was it appreciated? Was it useful? How do you learn about that?
That's a good question, Scott. And I think there's two different ways of how you receive or how kind of to your question, right? The first is going to be, hey, I want to make sure you actually received it. Did you actually get it? So with our new system, hopefully that feels like a better process. So with the new hearing management system, you submit your testimony online yourself. It shows up and you can see that it's been received and that it's going to be a part of that official record. So I think the system that we have now does a little bit better job of making sure you can have confidence. Let's say a staff member is overwhelmed and hasn't gotten back to you and written an email that says, thank you, confirmed, I got it. You can see yourself that it's been received. Now, how it's perceived, that's going to be a little bit harder. One way is when you are in a hearing, does the council member actually engage with you and ask you questions? That's one of the ways you kind of get a sense of that was worthwhile testimony. But when I mentioned earlier, I know how frustrating it can be. You spent a lot of time preparing something, you sat around and you waited for your time to testify, you share it, and then there's not a single question, and they just kind of keep moving. That's a little demoralizing because you put a lot of time and energy into it. So I try my best, for example, in a hearing of trying to ask everybody a question, give you a chance, make sure you feel like I heard you. Doesn't mean I agree with every issue or even going to be able to make that change, but I want to make sure you feel like, you put in the effort. And so I want to make sure it's respected. But if you also ever want to reach back out to that committee staff, this is where I'd use the staff again and say, did you get the testimony? Did you have any additional questions? Did it make sense? And maybe that's one of the ways to kind of get a better read on the perception. And I hope that helps, but those are some of the ideas I would have.
And Chuck Elkins had asked in the chat, and these relate to the oversight hearings that are going on, where do we find the agency's submission of data that is background for the oversight and budget hearings? And Chuck, again, feel free to unmute yourself to follow up or add more to that.
Yeah, but it's a great question, Chuck. So when we do oversight, I'll kind of explain the process on where that data comes from. So right now, so my committee, for example, we have Department of Transportation coming up in a couple of weeks. So we sent a series of questions. I think it's something like 120 questions, very detailed pieces, to the agency and say, we want these responses before we have the hearing. They then work on getting responses to all of those questions. They send them back to us. We then post all those online. That's on the council website. And so that's a great place to be able to get that data. So those are public documents. So we put those things online so that people can go back and read and say, all right, let me read through those if you would like to do it. All 120 questions. What were the answers to those? Were there tables and charts and graphs that were attached to them? So we try to post all of that online. It can be a little bit overwhelming because some of them are very voluminous, but that's one of the ways that you can get that data. We post that onto the council's website, but also we're here to work for you. So if you've got a question and say, listen, where are the Department of Transportation's responses to the oversight questions? I would view that as my job and my committee staff's job to send you an email and say, here you go, here's the link, here's that document. They're public documents, so they're not just for me, they're for you too. And I think that's kind of the way I would look at that. And I just can see the question right there, where on the council website would those be posted? So if you go to dccouncil.gov, that's the main council website. And then within that, you will find links that take you through oversight and through the committees. And that's usually where they're posted. Because I don't think we've gotten responses yet, because we're kind of still in the process, there's probably nothing posted there right now. But if you'd like, Elizabeth, once those links go up, we could also share that with you so you could help share back to this group.
That'd be great. I just asked Laura Levinson to unmute herself because she has a question that relates to organizational testimony.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So, Councilmember, I sometimes testify on behalf of the DC chapter of the Sierra Club. I'm usually, the last few years, I've been the one who's compiled our testimony regarding the DC Department of Energy and the Environment, which we have a lot of interest in on a number of different topics. And we've put together kind of lengthy testimony, written testimony. And sometimes if I'm the one presenting it, sometimes I've gone through and tried to give a little snippet of each issue area, because I don't want, I want my colleagues to feel like I've touched on their issue that they care about, but it winds up sounding really pretty choppy. And after the last time I thought, well, maybe I really ought to, we ought to highlight one or two key issues from our testimony rather than giving a little snippet about each thing. So you've probably heard me do this, so I just thought I'd ask for your feedback on it.
I think, well, so that's where I think the power of having a couple of people be able to testify is you can pick a theme, and then let's say you focus on one part of that theme, and so you're sharing that testimony. I think that's very powerful. The next person, same overall theme, but is testifying the next piece and that. I think it can be difficult. And I've had this happen plenty of times when someone comes in and they're basically trying to get 8 different points across to me in 3 minutes. What ends up happening is they start speaking very fast because they see that clock ticking, and they're not able to go in much depth, right? And so they're like, hey, let me tell you about this really important issue over here. Oh, and by the way, this next thing, and this next thing. I think what it will more likely, the outcome of that is, I'm still listening and hearing those issues. I'm very likely not going to be able to have like in-depth follow-up questions because we just kind of touched the surface of 8 different issues. And so I think when you're able to, focusing on 1 or 2 things is more likely to draw the council member into the conversation, which is, again, that's part of your goal in a hearing, is you're trying to get me and others to ask you questions, to follow that thread you want me to follow. So I think when you have 1 or 2 issues that you focus on, you'll be able to draw the council member into that question and conversation the way you want. Great question.
Susan Sedgwick had asked about virtual hearings. In virtual hearings, do the council members see all the people who've logged in, or do they only see the panel who's testifying?
Oh, good question. All right. So when we have a hearing that's virtual, like right now, I have my computer open in Zoom into the gallery view. So I'm looking at 20 some odd little boxes right now, right? When we're in a hearing, we have both the people who are participants, and then we have people who are on the panel. So I only see the boxes of the people who were on the panel at that time. And the participants, what we do is for each, what we call each kind of panel that we're bringing up, we essentially my staff is transitioning them from the panel back to the participant room and then pulling them from the participant room up onto the panel. So I will only visually see, as the council member, I'm only going to visually see the panel that's testifying, but my staff is seeing everybody. They know that they know who all is there in the waiting room and things like that.
Thanks.
We had a question come in that I thought was actually pretty interesting and might be one for somebody
Aren't they all?
well, this is maybe one for somebody in the audience to answer.
Yeah.
Although given your own background, you might be able to address this as well. But the question was, what is it like to testify? And so I don't know if we have anyone. I mean, obviously Laura is, someone
I
who's
recognize several
testified,
people here who have testified
but
at the council and done quite
yeah,
well, I'll add. I mean, I have my own thoughts because I've testified at the council multiple times. But yeah, I'd
is
love to hear other people's perspective too.
is there someone who has testified who'd like to speak to this? Yeah, Marcy, go ahead. Oh, Marcy, unraise your hand. Scott Price raised hand. Okay, yeah,
Okay,
Scott.
I unmuted.
Okay, great. Scott, hold one
I've
second.
testified several times. I found it very unrewarding. Um, it wasn't before your committee. It was before
Thank you.
a council member. And the last time I testified, the council member said, well, that's interesting. Let's put a pin in that and come back to it.
And then didn't come
Never
back.
came back to it. Never came back to it. And it was just like I'd wasted a whole day of my life.
So that's what I was alluding to earlier about like recognizing that people spend a lot of time preparing and waiting, and it can be very frustrating. And at least why I try, and I know I'm not perfect, but I try to really make sure I'm asking questions of people because I know you took a lot of time to get there. I think we're going to Scott next.
Yeah, Scott, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
I was just going to pile on that you provide testimony, you work for weeks to get it ready, you rehearse it, you share it with friends, you send it through a chain of command to make sure everybody in your organization agrees with it, and then you provide it, and then crickets. And it is, I don't know what you can do about that. I don't think anybody expects that during a hearing, somebody's going to say something, you're going to say, we never thought of that. We're going to do that right tomorrow. I don't expect that you're going to do that or any other council member will do that. But the point is, there is no feedback. And it's not just, and from your past experience, there's a lot of work to get an organization to support a particular position they're going to put forward. And it's extremely frustrating to invest that labor and then hear nothing back.
Yep.
So, but thank you for listening, for your information tonight. Has been very informative. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate that. I don't think you're alone in that experience.
Lara, did you want to weigh in?
Sure. Yes. Well, I've certainly had experiences like Scott's, though I don't put nearly that much work into our testimony. So maybe you're working too hard on it, Scott. But we have with the Sierra Club, we have a few times found if we get enough people organized for the hearing and bring a perhaps a fairly new issue to the council, and we've actually, I think, really changed the dialogue around issues a couple of times by being really organized and bring a group of people and really pushing an issue in a hearing. And then, we might see the council member then taking our questions and asking the government witnesses those questions. And I guess we're not supposed to talk about issues, so I probably shouldn't give an example, but we did influence the policy of the Green Bank, for example. And there's some, I think the more organized you could be into, if you just hit it in the hearing at the one time, it might not be enough to move the needle, but if you're able to follow up with meetings with staff or talk to the council member in your neighborhood, or some sort of follow-up, which can be hard because we're all really busy, that's a way to get more of a reaction. And then there's some council members that their eyes glaze over when they hear what the Sierra Club has to say, and they don't want to have anything to do with us. Most of them aren't like that. Certainly not you, Charles.
I appreciate that. I know we're going to turn to Mary, but just real fast on that point to Scott's. I mean, one of the other suggestions I would have. So while when I'm listening to testimony, I'm usually kind of maybe jotting down a few notes. I'm thinking about what type of question, what seemed really interesting here, what might I ask? My staff also is writing questions to me. They're maybe jotting it down, they're typing it up and saying, hey, ask this question. And sometimes they've already talked to you before the hearing even happens. And you say to the staff, it'd be really great if the council member asked me about this, I could expand on that issue. Or if you'll ask me about that, I could talk more about it. So sometimes you can kind of prime the pump a little bit and even suggest the question you want to get asked to the staff, which then filters it up to me. And then I ask it as if I thought of it myself.
Mary, did you want to weigh in on this?
I'm weighing in on a different thing. I'm following up on what Christine Healy talked about, which is that in the testimony we've often given before the Committee on Health, we are representing people who are involved in long-term care, who are bedridden. They can't take particular time during a virtual hearing. And we have begun talking, and we are calling them hidden voices. And we've begun to talk about how you might be able to say, I would like to present video testimony from a person so-and-so and so-and-so who suffers and or a family member that suffers when a home health aide doesn't come. Have you ever run into that, Charles? And what advice could you give about that?
We've definitely had testimony from people that record it on video and then play it. That requires a little bit of coordination with the staff. So in those situations, for example, we've had folks that say, all right, I've collected, we had some students, for example. So they were in school, so they couldn't be there. So they recorded the students' testimony. Then they talked with us in advance of the hearing and said, I've got 4 students who are going to testify, but they're testifying via video. And so they get to have the right, just like everybody else. So they should have their 3 minutes. We want to have their video. And can you work with us to set up the video so we could play that when it's time? And we did that. We were able to accommodate that and make that work. We've also had situations where people who are non-English speakers are saying, I want to be able to testify. So we have an interpreter who will be there, or someone will come and say, I'm going to read the testimony of, and the person might even be sitting right there and say, I'm going to read their testimony, and they'll read it in that person's voice so that it can be heard. So there's a couple of different ways that it's happened where other people help deliver the way testimony that otherwise may not be heard. I should also note, we also at the council will accommodate language. We have, for example, we were able to get ASL interpreters. We can get other interpreters. We do typically need, I think it's usually 2 days notice to make sure we can get folks hired for that. But that's one of the ways that we make sure folks testify. And then the last thing I'll mention is that I frequently work to be able to allow people to testify anonymously. And that sometimes happens where there's either a whistleblower who maybe needs to testify. It may also be a survivor or victim of crime. I've had multiple situations where we've helped survivors of domestic violence or of crime who cannot get on camera and be able to share their story, but their story is really, really important. We need to hear it. And so we work to make sure that it can be done anonymously or through a surrogate who reads the testimony for them. So that's, again, where staff comes in and is super helpful. They will work to make that happen. or at least they should. I know my staff will. Everybody should.
We're just about at time, but Alex Baca from Greater Washington had a fantastic comment in the chat that I want to make sure gets on the recording. Alex, are you willing to unmute yourself and share that?
Yeah, happy to. Hi, I'm happy to jump in. Thanks, Councilmember, for your information. I just wanted to let everyone know that one of the hugely important things about submitting testimony, whether you do it in person, whether a council member calls on you, whether you're the only one testifying like on your issue or not, is that there's a public record. And I'm an advocate. I feel very lucky that I get paid full time to work on the stuff that I care about. I know that's incredibly privileged, but also I look at the records to like going back like decades sometimes. Like I'm looking at what people have said at committee hearings or on bills that are relevant to what I work on or at roundtables. So it's not just the council who's using what you say, right? Because there is a public record. Journalists will look at it sometimes, just like some of your ANC commissioners will look at it sometimes. So it's not like it is for council business, right? Like this is how the legislative process works. But I do just want to, reassure some people that even if you're not hearing immediately, like from the council member in the form of asking questions, like it's quite possible that someone in the future who like you will never know or think about, like may see what you say by virtue of it being part of the public record. So if you do have time and you are able, it is definitely worth it. You don't have to testify for everything all of the time, but I definitely read the record. So, keep it up. Thank you.
Can I add two more pieces to that? I really appreciate that, Alex. And again, because like hearing Scott's frustration is disappointing, right? Because again, as I've kind of alluded to, I full well know how much time and energy went into preparing that testimony. There's two reasons though, even if a councilor doesn't ask you a question, two reasons why I think it is important to prepare that testimony, get it submitted, and frankly, get it submitted in advance is really helpful. The first is that, again, remember that staff that are prepping for that hearing, for the committee chair, they're making, like, I have a whole, document basically that is prepping me for what the hearing's about, who's testifying about what are the issues, and then prompting questions for me to ask. So I think that's a really important, you're helping prepare and make it more likely I'm going to ask a question when you get that testimony in advance. The second piece is when you're talking about a legislative hearing, being able to have your testimony be a part of the legislative record is really important when, let's say the courts need to interpret what the law meant. They will turn to the legislative record. They're going to look to say, because that's the thing that it's going to outlast me, it's going to outlast you, but that legislative record is there. And so that's a really helpful space to kind of look at and be able to, for the courts to say, what were these people talking about? What was the issue motivating them? Why did they pick that word versus that word? And that's a really important part of that. So, to Scott, that testimony you prepared will show up in that space. And I think it's really helpful that way.
We do need to be wrapping up because we are at time, but Ann Coleman had a fantastic comment in the chat that I would really like her to share about the value of testifying. So Ann, go ahead.
Okay, I've testified many times with different experiences, but many, many years ago, when the first Family and Medical Leave Act was coming through in the late 80s, I had a very personal story. There were a million organizations. They all testified before me. I had to take my day off from work. And at the end, it was me and the chairman. Mm-hmm. And we had this long dialogue. She was really interested, and she asked me to submit suggestions for changes. So that was probably my best experience ever testifying.
That's wonderful, Ann. From the council's perspective, like my mindset, right? Like once I've hit hour 10 of a hearing, there's not much difference to hour 11 or 12, right? Like I'm there, right? I've got my little bag of peanuts and a bottle of water, and I am doing my best to kind of stay there. And I think there's many moments like that where it's kind of towards the end of a hearing, someone has really been there all day long. They share their personal story, and it's what draws me into that conversation when I might be kind of tired, after 12 hours of having everyone testify. So it's really wonderful to hear that you felt like that was impactful and it made a difference. And I hope all of you will kind of feel inspired by that too. Like, again, sharing a personal story, why something matters to you, I think is really, really powerful. And it helps. Imagine you had to sit for 12 hours and there's 150 people that are all coming to talk to you about the same thing, right? Your challenge is you're trying to think about how do you break through that so that the counselor hears your voice and your experience and your idea, right? And so I think sharing your personal stories is a really important part of that. And so I appreciate you sharing that, Anne, because I think it's really powerful.
With that, I wanted to thank everyone who's been involved in this tonight. Certainly thank our Councilmember Charles Allen for taking time tonight to meet with us about this issue and share his expertise. I wanted to thank all the people who submitted questions in advance. I wanted to thank all the folks who asked questions tonight. I wanted to thank, obviously, Aaron, once again, Aaron Sheehan, our events chair, who did such a fantastic job setting this up. I wanted to thank our representatives to the DC Democrats, Frank Avery, Don Dinan, Melissa Leitner, and Dorinda White, who were our kind of co-hosts for this evening. Mobilize is going to send you a follow-up asking for feedback. Let us know what you thought. We do actually read the comments that you submit. We have some volunteering opportunities with the Ward 6 Dems right now. One is that we are looking for a new secretary. That's basically the person who, with our treasurer, helps keep our records. But our secretary who was elected last June sadly ended up taking a job that no longer allows her to be our secretary. So that is normally an elected position, but for the remainder of the term, it'll be someone who will be appointed to the position. So if that sounds of interest to you, get in touch with me. We are also going to be doing a ton of GOTV work this year, both inside DC for our own elections here and outside DC for the congressional elections and the presidential election. So definitely keep your eyes open for that. We've got some upcoming events that we are in the process of planning. One is a public safety series that's actually kicking off 1 week from tonight, also with Councilmember Allen. It's an event that's an in-person event at the Hill Center. Unfortunately, the in-person event is full at this point, but you will be able to watch that on the Hill Center's Facebook page. They will be broadcasting it live, and it's about the carjacking issues that we've been dealing with. We are also in the process of setting up some other events in that series. We're going to be doing a meet and greet with Councilmember McDuffie, who is obviously not new to the council, but is new to being at large. We're looking to do an event on home rule, kind of a home rule 101 for folks, and hopefully getting an Anacostia River Keepers tour booked for the Ward 6 Dems sometime once the weather is a little warmer. You can learn more and stay up to date on all of that by going to our website, ward6dems.org/join, and joining us. And all that does, all the joining entails, is you get our bi-monthly newsletter. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone once again, and have a fantastic evening.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, Aaron, everybody. This was great. Thank you all.
Thank you.